Without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Gere.
Happy COVID Wednesday to you guys. And I am delighted that you chose to join me. You could be doing anything in this world, but no, you're wise enough, you're bright enough. I can see it in your eyes. You came for some stories. The excitement is building. We're beginning now. This is the story of the West Coast, Northwest Coast, Seattle, Oregon, all the way up the coast of Canada, going into Alaska. This is the story of the prince. As with all villages in the Northwest Coast, there were two tribes. One was for women, one was for men. And there was a king of the men, and there was a queen of the women. And they mingled, and they talked, and they arranged their affairs, but each had private ceremonies and things that only men would know and things that only women would know. It was a wonderful arrangement, except that in this case, the king of the men's group had a son, and the queen of the women's group had a daughter, and they were about the same age. And everybody thought, wouldn't it be great if she and he got together and the two tribes could be wed? Great idea. Adults have lots of ideas for kids, and in this case, he liked her. She didn't really like him. Well, one day she was sitting in the middle of the village in like the open air field meadow. She was surrounded, of course, by her retinue of serving girls, and they were making moccasins, as I recall. And he came through the village. Now, when he came through the village, he was carried. He had a whole group behind him. He was in his fine buckskin robe. He came walking right up to where there was a flurry all around. His guys circled. Her serving girls looked, and he came up to her and he goes, "The time has come. I would like to ask you to marry me." Oh, all the girls, oh, all the men, whoa. She went, "Well, I will consider marrying you, but to show that you love me, do a small favor for me." "What is it?" "Take your heavy knife, lay it on your cheek, and as a sign of your love for me, cut a deep groove that no one can ignore." And being in love, he took out his knife, he laid it on his cheek, and he cut deep. The blood ran across his white moccasin. Everyone was shocked. The scar would be clear forever. A flurry. She didn't think he'd do it. And they all went flustering, all the girls, and the men, they retried. The next week, of course, she was in the meadow again, and again, he came walking through the village. Right in front of her, he said, "Now, will you marry me?" "I would love to marry you, but as a sign of your love for me, take out your knife and do me this favor. Put it on your other cheek and make a groove so deep that no one will ignore it for the rest of your life. That will be your sign of your love for me." And of course, the young man in love took out the knife, put it against his cheek, and cut deep a groove. The blood stained his moccasin robes. Big flurry, the women left. A week later, with big, giant scabs on each cheek. Again, they sat in the clearing of the meadow. He came walking up with all of his retinue, and in front of everyone surrounding him to see what would happen this week, he said, "Now I have done what you asked, and now I ask of you the privilege of marrying me. Will you marry me?" "Well, I'd love to marry you, except for one thing, a small gesture. Take your long black hair, take the ponytail around your shoulders and take your knife and cut it off and offer it to me as a sign of your love. Now, beauty and fashion is particular to each group of people in the globe. And in this tribe and these people, the long black hair of a young man was his sign of being of age and being warrior. It was a sign of beauty and pride. But the young man was in love. And he took his long braid and he pulled it around, and he pulled out his knife and he cut off the hair, and he held it out for the princess as a sign of his love for her. She took the braid and she said, "Now I will answer you." "No, I won't marry you. You're ugly. You've got 2 big scars on the side of your face and your hair is short. Why would I marry you? All the things that are attributes of beauty and power, you have sacrificed. You're a fool." "No, why would I marry you?" And the cruel laughter spread through the town like a virus. And as he walked through the village, and he walked into his own little teepee. They don't have teepees there. They have like a mound, like a yurt. Like a mound, like a Quonset hut made out of bark. He grabbed all of his precious objects, threw them on his back. His 5 friends were around him. Then he turned to his friends. He said, "I will leave this village and I will never return until I have rectified this error in my judgment." The 5 friends said, "We are your friends and we will follow you everywhere. We have always pledged to go where our leader leads us." He said, "You do not have to make this sacrifice. Do not leave your families." They said, "We love you and we will go where you want." "No, you don't have to. We're going." "And I am going now." He began to run. And he ran as the sky filled with the sun went across the heavens. And by the time it had set, in the middle of the night, finally exhausted, he fell into the grass and turned behind him. And the 5 that had left with him were now 3. And in the morning he woke up at the dawn and he ran all day as the sun went across the sky. He ran across brambles. He poured through pathways. He jumped into rivers, swam to the other side. If there was a mountain, he climbed it. If there was a valley, he forged into it. If there was a thicket, he charged through it. And at the end of a long day, when the sun set and he ran still, finally he fell exhausted into the grass. He looked behind him. He had 1 friend. And in his weary state, he said, "Now I know you are true. You are truly my friend. I will follow you wherever you go." And they both fell asleep in the grass where they lay. But not for long. For soon there was a sound. The prince shook his friend awake and said, "Look, there was a few trees, then there was a little valley on the other side. Standing there was a woman who was glowing in blue light. The prince said, "Stay here. If I do not return in 3 days, then say I am dead. Return to the village. I must pursue this." The woman on the other side of the gully went. And he knew his fate had come. He rose and walked, following that glowing woman through the woods, interrupted by trees. He stumbled, he fell, he got up again. When he ran to get closer to her, she seemed to go faster. And when, of course, he went slower, she went back. She seemed to always be the same distance away. She went over a gully, he came down, and he found himself lost. Stumbling around in the dark, he heard another sound. He looked to his right, and there in the clearing, there was a hut, one of those same kind of yurt igloo bark skin. It was spinning. But at the door to the yurt, to the hut, was always facing him as the rest of the hut spun. He walked forward. He opened the door and went inside. Everything was black. In the darkness, his eyes slowly grew accustomed to the lack of light, and he could see more clearly. There, sitting at the other side of a table, was an old woman. Her hair was gray and long. Her hands were like roots. Her face was lined and valleyed. Her eyes glowed with two little bulbs of embers of life. She said, "Sit." He sat. She put some food, a mush, a goo in front of him, and she said, "Eat." Of course, he started to eat. Now, as he ate, he could feel the food beginning to fill his entire body. It was like a sight, like fireworks going off in his mouth. He ate another bite. The fireworks began to spread. His entire body was infused with new energy. He found that his eyes could see the woman clear as day. He was exploding inside of himself. He shook, he screamed. She said, "Listen to me. I will not repeat myself. Listen close so that you will live. When you leave this hut, you will walk up the mountain to the very top. There will be great wind, but you will see a lodge house. Go inside it. Do not look to the left or to the right. Do not touch anything, no matter what touches you, until you see that woman again, and do everything she tells you to do. And if you perform what I require of you, you will live, and if not, you die." Well, he did what he was told, wouldn't you? He walked out of the door. He walked to the top of the mountain. At the top of the mountain, the wind was blowing so strong. He could see a large house with the whole universe of animals and lightning and thunder and suns and moons. He walked forward to the door. When he reached the door, the wind stopped. He ducked his head and went inside of the house. It was so dark. He stood as he'd been told, and he could hear, looking at nothing, just forward, voices from the side. Fingers began to grab at him. "Prince, Prince, help me, help me." Fingers were tonguing. He could hear moaning voices all around. "Prince, help, help." Inside of him, he was shaking and shuddering, but he could not move. He kept his focus on the far end of the lodge. He could see the outlines of shapes of people hobbling and wounded. "Prince, help me, help me." He could not. He stayed focused. He looked at the far end of the lodge. There was a door, and finally she came. He walked forward quickly. He bowed to go inside of that door. Inside of that door, he was in a very small room, and there was a very big fire. And on top of that fire, there was a giant cauldron, big enough to get inside of. On one side was the glowing woman in blue. But on the other side, there was a man who was glowing in gold. The woman. And by her motion, he understood that he was to put more wood on the fire. He put more wood in the fire until the heat was so intense his eyebrows were being singed. He squint his eyes to keep from being burned. His hair seemed to be on fire. It was so hot in the room. More wood. He did what he was bid to do until the water in the pot was boiling and boiling and bubbling. It burned him when he came close. Jump into the pot. He jumped into the pot, and when he did, the heat of that infernal boiling water burned away all his hair, burned away his skin, burned away the nose hairs, the teeth. His sinews were all gone. The muscles were burnt away. All that was left in the pot, writhing in the heat of that water, was his skeleton. Now it was the glowing golden man who picked up a paddle. There's a lot of waterways in the Northwest Coast. Paddles are a big part of their culture. He dipped the paddle inside of the pot of boiling water and pulled up the bones intact and whole and put it on the ground. The glowing man of gold and the blue woman held hands and switched sides, stepping over the body as they did. A miracle. All the muscles grew back. All the sinews returned to where they were. All of the eye sockets, the nose hairs, the full, long hair now was long, black, and full. And the 2 scars were gone. He stood up. Go into the world and make it better. He dipped under the little doorway. He walked into the room. Now he was glowing with light. And he saw all the maimed and tortured and beat, virus-infected people with their inability to breathe, their lesions, their cuts. And his very eyes were like lightning, for everything he looked at was healed, until he walked out of that longhouse, and behind him was an army of followers. He walked down through the coming dawn light, through the forest in no time at all, until his one friend waiting in the grass saw him coming. He's a ghost! He's a ghost! No ghost. I am the incarnation of a new future. I am the dawn of a new day. Come, we will make the world a better place. And the 2 friends with their new retinue walk back into that village. We never hear about that princess, but we do hear about a new day in that village. For that glowing leader led that village in beautiful ways of righteousness and goodness for a very, very long time. And that's the story from the Southwest Coast of the prince, death and resurrection, making a new day for his people.